and so we settle in. You can feel your body beginning to grow heavy in the most pleasant way. In our time together tonight, there is nothing to examine, nothing to understand, only the gentle rhythm of a story. A story about something simple, something you see every day: bread, the staff of life, a symbol of community and nourishment, except for a very long time, for thousands of people, it was also, occasionally, the staff of a truly terrible, limb-distorting, mind-bending end. Before we drift too far, if you feel a connection to this place, you're welcome to leave a quiet like or subscribe. Think of it not as a task, but as leaving a soft footprint in the sand before you continue your journey inward. As you're settling in, feel free to leave a quiet comment, letting me know what city you're listening from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's a nice way to feel a silent connection to all the other people settling down to this same story, in this same moment. Alright, let the shadows in your room grow long and soft. Maybe you can hear the faint sound of your own breathing. And together, let's allow the story to begin. The sky above you is the color of a tired dishcloth, a smear of gray that promises more rain. It's been a wet spring, a cool summer, and now, as harvest time arrives, the damp has settled deep into the earth, into your clothes, and into your bones. You are standing in a field. Don't worry about the exact year, could be 857, or 1085, or 1322. This particular story doesn't change much for 1,000 years. The air smells of wet soil and the faint, grassy scent of cut stalks. You're holding a small, curved sickle, its wooden handle worn smooth by the grip of your father, and his father before him. Around you, the rye stands tall, its slender stalks drooping under the weight of the grain and the moisture in the air. This isn't the golden wheat that the Lord eats, the kind that makes fluffy white bread. This is rye, the poor man's grain. It's hardy, stubborn, able to grow in soil where wheat would simply give up. It makes a dark, heavy, and deeply sour bread, but it fills the belly, and right now, that's all that matters. Your back aches. You've been bent over since the first weak light of dawn, slicing through the stalks, bundling them into sheaves. Your fingers are raw from the scratchy stems, but there is a quiet satisfaction to it. This field, this grain, this is your family's survival for the coming winter. Each head of grain is a spoonful of porridge, a slice of bread. You can't afford to waste a single one. And that's when you notice them, scattered amongst the healthy, pale brown grains of rye or other things. They are longer than a normal kernel, curved slightly, like a small, dark jewel. Their color is a deep, unsettling purple-black, the color of a day-old bruise. They feel hard under your thumb, almost like a tiny stone trying to imitate a seed. The old woman in the village calls them wolf's teeth or rice pears. They've always been there, some years more than others. This year, after all the rain, there seemed to be more than you can remember. You pause for a moment, the sickle hanging loosely in your hand. A thought, formless and fleeting, passes through your mind. Should you pick them out? You could. You could sit for hours upon hours, meticulously sorting through the harvest, plucking out every single one of these strange, dark growths. But the sun is already sinking. Your stomach is a hollow pit of hunger, and the Lord's tax collector is coming in 2 days to take his portion. There is no time. There is never enough time. And this is a question that historians and agricultural scientists still debate to this day. Did you, the medieval farmer, have any idea these were dangerous, or were they just another imperfection in a life full of imperfections? Some scholars argue that a folk knowledge must have existed, a quiet warning passed down through generations. Others believe you were completely in the dark, attributing any subsequent sickness to bad luck, bad air, or the wrath of God. But for you, in this field, it's not an academic question. It's a practical one. You have a family to feed. You have a winter to survive. Wasting grain is not an option. So you sigh, a small cloud of steam in the chilly air. You gather the stalks, the healthy and the blighted together, and you bind them with a twist of straw. The dark little spurs disappear into the bundle. Hidden, it all looks like harvest. It all looks like food. The sack on your back grows heavier as you work, filled with the promise of bread, but also with a secret you don't even know you're keeping. The sun finally dips below the horizon, and you head for home, unaware that the real horror of the year has only just begun. You step across the threshold of your home, the heavy sack of grain a familiar weight on your shoulders. The world outside, with its damp air and fading light, is left behind. Inside, it's a single, smoke-filled room. The floor is packed earth, cool and uneven beneath your worn leather shoes. A few wooden stools, a rough-hewn table, and seeping pallets stuffed with straw are the only furniture. In the center of the room, the heart of your small world glows the hearth. A low fire murmurs, casting long, dancing shadows on the wattle and daub walls. Your family looks up as you enter. A nod is exchanged. Words are not needed. The heavy sack speaks for itself. It promises another day, another week of survival. You let the sack slide to the floor with a heavy thud, sending up a small puff of dust. The next task of the day awaits, a task as old as farming itself. You drag over the quern stone. It's a simple, ancient machine to heavy, circular stones, one resting on top of the other. The top stone has a hole in the center to feed the grain and a wooden handle sticking out from its side. You pour a measure of the newly harvested rye into the top hole. You see the grains, mostly brown and gray, but you also see the dark purple-black spurs mixed in. They slide in with all the others, disappearing into the stone's gullet. There is no thought of separating them now. It would be like trying to separate the raindrops in a storm. They are one and the same. You grip the wooden handle and begin to push. The stone groans as it turns. A low, scraping sound that fills the small room. It is the sound of effort, the sound of sustenance. Your shoulders and back, already aching from the field, protest with a dull fire of their own. Round and round you push, the stone grinding the grain between its gritty surfaces. A fine dust begins to rise, catching the faint light from the fire, creating a hazy, shimmering cloud in the air. Slowly, from the edges of the stones, the flour begins to emerge. It trickles out, a soft, grayish powder. You notice it's not a uniform color. There are tiny, dark purple flecks mixed throughout, almost invisible unless you look closely. It gives the whole pile of flour a slightly bruised, shadowy tint. Does it smell different? Perhaps. There's the usual dusty, earthy scent of rye, but maybe something else underneath. A faint, slightly bitter, almost medicinal smell. But the room is already full of smells: wood smoke, damp wool, cooking onions. One faint, strange scent is easily lost in the chorus. And besides, flour is rarely just flour. This brings us to a rather unappetizing but common practice of the time. In lean years, and most years were lean, it was common to stretch the flour. A little bit of dried, powdered pea stalk, some ground up acorns, or in truly desperate times, even fine sawdust or clay would be mixed in. This practice of using flour extenders meant that the color and taste of bread weren't ever consistent. A slightly off-color loaf was the norm, not the exception. The fact that your flour today has a purplish tint is no great cause for alarm. It is simply the color of this year's survival. You pause to wipe sweat from your brow with the back of a dusty hand, leaving a gray smear. Now your wife takes over, scooping the flour into a wooden bowl. She adds water from a bucket and a lump of bubbling starter saved from the last batch. She plunges her hands into the mixture and begins to knead. The dough is not light and airy. It is a thick, sticky, heavy mass. She works it on the table, folding, pushing, turning. It's a rhythmic, comforting motion, a promise of food being made real. Here lies another point of historical debate: the taste. Did this tainted flour create a bread that tasted foul? Some historical accounts mention a disgusting taste, while others don't mention it at all. Modern experiments trying to replicate the bread have yielded conflicting results. Some find it unpleasantly bitter. Others find the taste is mostly masked by the strong, sour flavor of the rye itself. It's entirely possible that to you, sitting in this smoky room, the bread you were about to eat tasted normal, or at least no worse than usual. Finally, the dough is shaped into a flat, round loaf and placed on a hot stone at the edge of the hearth's embers. There's no oven, just the radiant heat of the fire. The smell of baking begins to fill the room, a coarse, sour, yet deeply welcome aroma. It is the smell of hope. After what feels like an eternity, the loaf is done. The crust is dark, almost black in places, and hard as wood. Your wife pulls it from the hearth, tapping it with her knuckles. It makes a dull, solid thud. She places it on the table, and your family gathers around. The steam rises from it, carrying that same, earthy, slightly strange scent. A knife that has seen better days saws through the tough crust, revealing a dense, moist, purplish-grey interior. A piece is handed to you. It's warm. You lift it to your lips. It is your daily bread, the reward for your labor, the very substance of your life. You take a bite. The days that follow are a blur of the same exhausting rhythm. You rise before the sun, eat a piece of the dark, sour bread with a bit of cheese or a thin vegetable stew, and head out to the fields to finish the harvest. The work is relentless. There is going to be threshed, winnowed, and finally stored in the hopes that it will last through the long, lean months of winter. Every evening, you return home, your muscles screaming in protest, to eat another meal built around that same bread. It is your fuel, the very thing that gives you the strength to keep going. A week passes, then another. The last of the rye is brought in from the fields, and a heavy, persistent autumn rain begins to fall, turning the paths around your village into a thick, clinging mud. You spend your days indoors now, mending tools, patching the thatch on your roof, preparing for the cold to come. The world shrinks to the four walls of your hut and the comforting, smoky haze inside. It starts subtly, so subtly, in fact, that you don't even recognize it as a beginning. You're sitting by the fire, carving a new handle for a spade, when you feel it. A tingle. It's in the tips of your fingers on your left hand. It's not painful. It's just strange. It feels like the sensation you get when your hand has fallen asleep and is just starting to wake up. A faint, pins and needles feeling, a sort of internal buzzing. You stop carving and shake your hand, flexing your fingers. The feeling subsides, and you think nothing of it. A pinched nerve, perhaps, from the repetitive work in the fields. But then it comes back. The next day, it's in both your hands, and this time, it's also in your feet. A weird, crawling sensation just beneath the skin of your soles. As if a line of tiny, invisible ants were marching up and down your ulcers. You find yourself stamping your feet on the hard earth floor, trying to shake the feeling away. Your wife asks what's wrong. You just shrug and say your feet are cold. This initial stage, this creeping numbness and tingling, well-documented symptom, the ergot alkaloids, the invisible poison from the fungus in your bread, have begun their insidious work. They are constricting your blood vessels. Not enough to cause major damage yet, but just enough to reduce the blood flow to your extremities. Your nerves, starved of their full, rich supply of blood and oxygen, are starting to send confused, garbled signals back to your brain. The message they send is this phantom tingling, a phenomenon doctors today call paresthesia. A few more days pass. The tingling is no longer an occasional visitor. It's a constant companion. It's a low-level hum of numbness in your hands and feet. At night, you have trouble sleeping. The sensation seems to get stronger in the stillness of your straw pallet. You lie awake, shifting your legs, rubbing your arms, trying to find a position where the feeling will stop. It doesn't. Sometimes it's a burning itch deep inside your muscles that you can't scratch. Other times it's a profound, chilling coldness in your toes. A cold that feels like it's coming from the bone itself. Even when you press them against the warm body of your sleeping wife. You start to feel clumsy. You drop the knife while eating. You fumble when trying to tie a knot. Your fingers, which had been so skilled at their work for your entire life, feel like thick, clumsy sausages. They don't seem to belong to you anymore. This is where a little known, and frankly bizarre, historical detail comes in. Some medieval chronicles describing this stage of the sickness mention that victims felt like their limbs were being beaten with sticks by invisible demons. This wasn't just a poetic description of pain. It speaks to the neurological chaos erupting in the body. The nerves weren't just tingling. They were firing off wildly, creating sensations of pressure, impact, and pain where none existed. Imagine trying to explain to someone that your leg feels like it's being repeatedly struck by a club while it's lying perfectly still. It sounds like madness. And you do start to worry about your mind. You tell no one. To complain is to be a burden. To admit to such a bizarre, inexplicable feeling is to invite suspicion. Is it a sign of weakness? A punishment for some forgotten sin? You see your neighbors every day. You see your own family. No one else is stamping their feet or constantly shaking their hands. It seems to be your secret, your private torment. You eat your bread, the same bread everyone is eating, and you wonder what is so wrong with you. You try to work, to maintain the facade of normalcy, but the constant, distracting buzz under your skin is making it harder and harder. The dread, a cold and heavy stone, settles in your gut. This is not just a passing chill. This is something else. Something deep and something wrong. The tingling was just the overture. The real symphony of suffering begins on a perfectly ordinary night. You are huddled on your straw pallet, trying in vain to find a comfortable position that will quell the incessant crawling in your limbs. The fire in the hearth has died down to a bed of glowing, red orange embers, casting a faint, warm light across the single room. The rest of your family is asleep. Their soft, rhythmic breathing the only sound besides the gentle patter of rain against the roof. It starts in your left calf. Not a tingle, not a pins and needles sensation. This is a fire. A searing, agonizing heat that feels as if someone has poured molten lead directly into your veins. You gasp, your body going rigid. The pain is so sudden, so intense. It steals your breath. It is a deep, internal burning, a sensation that has no counterpart in the natural world. You've been burned by hot coals from the fire before. You've scalded your hand in boiling water. This is not that. This is a fire that rages from within, consuming your flesh from the inside out. You bite down hard on the corner of your rough wool blanket to keep from screaming. A scream would wake the family. Inside panic and fear, you try to reason with it. It's a cramp. You tell yourself, a terrible, vicious cramp. You try to stretch your leg, to force the muscle to release. But the movement only intensifies the agony. The fire spreads, a liquid torment flowing down into your ankle, your foot, your toes. Your entire lower leg feels like it is roasting on a spit over an invisible flame. This is the symptom that gave the disease its most common and terrifying name, street. And furnace fire, or in Latin, ignis assacer, the holy fire. It was called a fire because there was simply no other word to describe it. Victims consistently reported a feeling of being burned alive, of their limbs being consumed by an unholy heat, even as their skin, to the touch, often felt paradoxically cold and clammy. The ergot alkaloids were now causing extreme, prolonged vasodilation. The blood vessels in your limbs were clamping down so tightly that the blood flow was slowing to a trickle. Your tissues, muscles, nerves, skin were screaming out in protest. Starved of oxygen, this profound lack of blood flow, or ischemia, is what creates a pain signal of unimaginable intensity. Sweat beads on your forehead. cold and slick. Despite the feeling of being aflame, you try to push yourself up, to crawl towards the water bucket. But a new wave of fire erupts. This time in your right arm. From the elbow down, you collapse back onto the straw, a strangled groan escaping your lips. Your body is betraying you. It has become a torture chamber. Through the haze of pain, you glance at your afflicted leg in the dim, red glow of the embers. It looks the same. There are no flames, no blisters, no redness. There is nothing to see. This is a private hell, visible only to you. You are being immolated on a pyre that no one else can perceive. Herein lies a curious detail that adds another layer of psychological terror. Because there were often no external signs of injury in these early stages, the sufferer's complaints could be met with skepticism. To the outside observer, you were just a person writhing on groaning. It was your word against the evidence of their eyes. This invisibility of the source of pain led many to believe it was supernatural in origin, a demon's touch, a witch's curse, or the punishing hand of God. It was a holy fire, a fire sent from the heavens to purify a tainted soul. The night stretches into an eternity. You drift in on doubt of a delirious state. The pain your only anchor to reality. At one point, you hallucinate that your blanket is woven from hot coals. At another, you see small, fiery imps dancing on your chest. These visions are another direct effect of the ergot alkaloids, some of which are chemically related to powerful hallucinogens. They are attacking your central nervous system, blurring the line between the waking world and the nightmare world. When the first grey light of dawn finally seeps through the cracks in the wall, you are exhausted, trembling, and utterly broken. The intense, burning agony has subsided to a deep, throbbing ache, a constant, miserable reminder of the inferno that raged through the night. Your wife stirs, sees the sweat-soaked state of you, the haunted look in your eyes. She touches your forehead. It's cool. She looks at your leg. It appears normal. But when she asks what is wrong, the only words you can find to describe the night's ordeal are, "I'm on fire." The morning after your night of fire is bleak. You can barely move. Every muscle aches, not with the familiar soreness of hard labor, but with a deep, cellular exhaustion. The burning sensation has retreated, leaving behind a tender, bruised feeling, as if your limbs were beaten while you slept. You try to eat the morning's bread, but the act of chewing feels monumental, and the sour taste of the rye now seems vaguely menacing. You force yourself to your feet, determined to maintain a semblance of normalcy. You cannot be sick. Sickness is a luxury your family cannot afford. A day not worked is a day closer to starvation. You stumble out of the hut into the grey, muddy world of the village, and it's then you realize you are not alone in your suffering. Across the narrow, winding path that serves as a street, you see your neighbor, Thomas, a man usually known for his steady hands and quiet demeanor. He is standing outside his hut, staring blankly at the sky. Then, without warning, his body begins to jerk. His head snaps back. His arms flail wildly, striking the wattle and daub wall of his house with a series of dull thuds. His legs kick out uncontrollably, and he lets out a guttural cry, a sound more animal than human. He collapses into the mud, his body convulsing, limbs twitching and writhing as if animated by a malevolent puppeteer. His wife rushes out, her face a mask of terror, trying to hold him down, trying to prevent him from swallowing his own tongue. Further down the path, near the communal well, a small group has gathered. They are watching a young woman, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, who is spinning in circles, laughing and shrieking at things no one else can see. She speaks in a taunt of gibberish, her eyes wide with a manic, unfocused terror. She claws at her own arms, points a trembling finger at the clouds, and then collapses into a fit of weeping. You have just witnessed the other face of street, Anthony's fire, while you are suffering from the gangrenous form, characterized by the burning pain and restricted blood flow. Your neighbors are in the grip of the convulsive form. This is a crucial distinction that historians and medical experts puzzled over for centuries. Why would the same poison produce such dramatically different symptoms in different populations? The leading theory today is that it depends on the specific cocktail of alkaloids present in the ergot fungus, which can vary by region, climate, and harvest. It may also have been influenced by the baseline diet of the population. A diet deficient in vitamin A, for instance, might make a person more susceptible to the convulsive form. The convulsive type was a direct assault on the central nervous system. The alkaloids were disrupting the normal flow of neurotransmitters in the brain, causing it to send out a storm of chaotic electrical signals. This resulted in violent seizures, muscle spasms, and terrifying hallucinations. Sufferers reported seeing demons, angels, and monstrous beasts. They described feeling bugs crawling all over their bodies or having their insides twisted into knots. They were, for all intents and purposes, trapped in a waking nightmare, their own minds turned into instruments of torture. You stand frozen, leaning against the damp wall of your hut for support. The scene is one of pandemonium. A child is having a fit in a doorway. An old man is wandering through the mud, muttering to himself, his hands clasped to his head as if to keep it from splitting apart. The healthy villagers, and there are still many of them, for now look on with a mixture of fear and suspicion. This is not a normal sickness. This is not the familiar cough of a winter cold or the fever of a festering wound. This is madness. It is a plague of the mind and the body. The priest, a thin, anxious man, emerges from the small wooden church, his face pale. He begins to walk among the afflicted, holding his cross aloft, sprinkling holy water that sizzles in no one's imagination but his own. He speaks of demonic possession, of a spiritual sickness that has taken root in the village. This explanation, in a world without germ theory, makes a terrifying kind of sense. How else could you explain your neighbor Thomas, a good and pious man, suddenly thrashing on the ground and blaspheming? It must be the work of an outside, evil force. You look from the convulsing body of your neighbor to your own hands, which are still tingling with the memory of the fire. You feel a new kind of fear, one that is colder and sharper than the physical pain. Are you next? Will your mind also be shattered? Will you lose control of your body and begin to dance and scream in the mud? You don't understand that you are suffering from two sides of the same coin. To you, it looks like two entirely different plagues have descended upon your village, a plague of fire and a plague of madness. The days that follow feel like a descent into a nightmare. The convulsive fits continue to rack the village, but for you, the torment remains a quiet, internal inferno. The burning sensation in your limbs comes and goes in waves, each one leaving you weaker than the last. In between the fiery attacks, a new, more horrifying symptom begins to emerge. It starts with your toes. The constant, deep chill you felt in them for weeks has become profound. They feel less like a part of your body and more like small stones of ice attached to your feet. One morning, you summon the courage to look at them closely. Really look at them. In the weak light filtering through the door, the nail on your big toe, you notice, has a strange, bluish tint. The skin around it is pale and waxy. There is no feeling. You pinch the tip of your toe. Toad. Nothing. It is as numb as a block of wood. You try to tell yourself it's just the cold, but a deep, cold knot of dread tightens in your stomach. This feels different. Final. Over the next week, the color deepens. The pale blue darkens to a bruised purple, the same color as the strange grains you saw in the rye. The discoloration creeps slowly up your toe, then begins to appear on the others. The line between the living, pinkish skin of your foot and this creeping tide of death is sharp and clear. This is the beginning of gangrene. The vasoconstriction caused by the ergot alkaloids has become so severe and so prolonged that the tissues in your extremities are dying. The capillaries, the tiny blood vessels that feed your skin and muscle, have been clamped shut for too long. Without blood, there is no oxygen, no nutrients. The cells are suffocating. It's a slow, inexorable process of decay. but it is happening while the limb is still attached to your living body. You watch this process with a detached horror. It doesn't even seem real. Your foot belongs to a stranger. You hide it from your family, keeping your worn shoes on at all times, wrapping your feet in rags at night. It is a shameful secret, a mark of some terrible corruption that has taken root inside you. Then, the color changes again. The purple darkens to a dead, horrifying blood. The skin becomes dry and leathery. The toes begin to shrink and wither, a process called mummification. A truly bizarre and macabre detail of this condition, often noted in historical chronicles, is that the affected part would become so dry and brittle that it might just fall off. A finger, a toe, even a whole hand or foot, could detach at the joint with surprising neatness and very little, if any, bleeding. The body, in its desperate attempt to save itself, essentially amputates the dead tissue. You see it happen to an old man who lives at the edge of the village. He has been suffering from the fire for weeks. One day, you see him sitting outside his hut, a blank expression on his face. Lying in the dirt beside him are two of his fingers. They look like small, blackened twigs. He doesn't seem to have noticed. There is no blood, just the meat, sealed off stumps where his fingers used to be. The smell starts soon after. It's a sickly sweet, cloying odor of decay. This is the scent of wet gangrene, where the dead tissue becomes infected with bacteria. Your foot, once just numb and discolored, now becomes swollen and blistered. The pain, which had been a fire, transforms into a deep, foul, throbbing agony. The line between the dead black tissue and the living tissue becomes inflamed undoing. The psychological toll is immense. You are watching yourself rot. You are a living man, breathing, thinking, feeling, yet a part of you is already dead. You are a walking corpse. The fear is constant. How far will it go? Will it stop at your toes, your foot, your knee? Historians still argue about the mortality rates of gangrenous ergotism, but most estimates are grim. Without medical intervention which, for you, does not exist, the infection from the gangrene would often spread, leading to a systemic infection, or sepsis. That was the real killer. But for the victim, the immediate horror was the visible, undeniable evidence of their own decay. It was a physical manifestation of the curse everyone was whispering about. Your body was literally being unmade, piece by piece, by the bread you had eaten to survive. The irony is so cruel, it's almost poetic. The staff of life has become the scythe of death. You lie on your pallet, feverish, the stench of your own decay filling the small hut, and you wonder how much of you will be left when the fire finally burns itself out. The village is now a place of open misery and fear. The air, thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth, now carries a new scent, the foul odor of sickness and decay. The sounds are different, too. The usual rhythm of village life, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of women at the well, is replaced by a grim soundtrack of weeping, the occasional shriek from a tormented mind, and the low, constant moaning of those in pain. Into this atmosphere of despair steps the priest, Father Martin. He is no longer just anxious. He is a man possessed by a divine and terrible certainty. His eyes burn with the conviction of a man who has been given a glimpse of God's terrible ledger. He stands on a barrel in the center of the muddy village square, his black robes flapping in the cold wind, the small wooden church behind him. A crowd gathers, the healthy, the worried, and even a few of the afflicted who are lucid enough to walk. You are there, leaning heavily on a crude crutch you fashioned from a tree branch, your blackened foot wrapped in dirty rags. This is not a sickness of the body, he proclaims, his voice cracking with emotion. He raises a thin, trembling finger to the grey sky. This is a sickness of the soul. We have strayed from the path of righteousness, and the Lord God, in his infinite and terrible wisdom, has sent a fire to cleanse us. His words hang in the chilly air for many of the villagers. This is not a new idea. It is a confirmation of their deepest fears. In a world where every storm, Every drought, every stillborn calf could be interpreted as a sign of divine pleasure or displeasure. A plague of this magnitude could only have one source. Look among you, the priest continues, his voice rising to a fever pitch. Who among you has harbored envy for your neighbor's harvest? Who has spoken ill of your kin? Who has failed to observe the holy days with a pure and contrite heart? He pauses, letting his gaze sweep across the huddled crowd. His eyes seem to linger on each person, as if he can see the dark spots on their souls. God sees all. He sees the greed in your hearts, the lies on your tongues, the sloth in your neighbors. This holy fire, this ignocersosa, is his judgment upon us. The idea that disease was a punishment for sin was the dominant medical and theological theory of the age. There was no concept of microorganisms, of fungal toxins, of epidemiology. There was only cause and effect on a grand, cosmic scale. You lived a good life. You were rewarded. You sinned. You were punished. The logic was simple, terrifying, and inescapable. The sickness became a public spectacle of a person's inner moral failings. Your rotting foot was not a medical condition. It was an outward sign of your inner spiritual corruption. The priest's sermon has a profound effect. It turns the shared suffering into a source of suspicion and recrimination. People began to look at each other differently. Is old Elspeth's madness a punishment for the way she gossips? Is Thomas' affliction a result of that time he shortchanged a traveling merchant? Your own mind starts to race, searching for a sin great enough to warrant this agonizing decay. Was it the time you cursed God under your breath when your ox died? The secret envy you felt towards the miller for his warm house? You are trapped in a feedback loop of pain and guilt. The physical agony confirms your sinfulness, and the guilt seems to make the pain even worse. This brings up a fascinating and somber detail from the historical record, the so-called plague confessions. In some chronicles of plagues, it is mentioned that people, driven mad by pain, fear, and religious fervor, would publicly confess to all sorts of sins, real and imagined. They would proclaim themselves adulterers, blasphemers, thieves, hoping that by exposing their sins to the world, they might appease the wrath of God and be spared. This rarely worked, of course, but it added to the atmosphere of moral panic. Father Martin then calls for a period of intense prayer and fasting. We must purify ourselves, he declares. We must mortify the flesh to save the soul, abstain from earthly pleasures, eat only what is necessary to survive. Pray until your knees are raw. Only through penance can we hope to turn away God's righteous anger. The irony of his prescription is so tragic it is almost unbearable. He is telling a starving, desperate populace to fast, and in doing so, he might, by complete accident, save a few of them, by eating less. There would be ingesting less of the ergot-tainted bread. It was a remedy born of theological terror that might have had a small, unintentional medical benefit. But for most, it is too little, too late. The poison is already in their bodies, its terrible work already underway. You listen to his words. The throbbing in your foot a dull counterpoint to his sermon. You feel not cleansed, but condemned. You have been judged by God, and you have been found wanting. The priest's sermon of divine punishment hangs over the village like a shroud, but it doesn't stop the suffering. If anything, it deepens the despair. Divine anger is a vast, impersonal force, but as the days wear on and more people fall victim to the fire and the madness, a new, more intimate, and more dangerous explanation begins to take root. It starts not in the church, but in the hushed conversations around the well, in the fearful glances exchanged over rickety fences. It starts with whispers of witchcraft. Human nature craves a target, a face to put on its suffering. God is to abstract, sin to personal. A witch, however, a witch is a neighbor. A witch is someone you can point to. Your gaze, and the gaze of the entire village, starts to fool old Agnes. She lives alone in a lopsided hovel at the very edge of the village, near the dark woods. She has always been an outsider. Her husband died years ago, Her children are grown and gone. She keeps to herself, emerging only to gather herbs from the forest or to trade for a bit of flour. She is old, her back bent, her face a road map of wrinkles. She mutters to herself sometimes. Her cat is an unnerving, sleek black animal with eyes that seem a little too intelligent. In a time of prosperity, Agnes is just a lonely old woman. In a time of plague and fear, she is a vessel for suspicion. The whispers start small. Did you see Agnes at the market last week? She looked at Thomas' prize pig, and the next day it fell ill. Then they grow. My child started his fits the very same day Agnes walked past our door, and then they become certainties. She was seen in the woods at night, dancing with shadows. She's the one who cursed the harvest. She poisoned the rye with the devil's magic. This is not a random leap of logic in your world. The link between a strange illness and malevolent magic was a deeply ingrained part of the medieval worldview. Malefic RUM. The concept of causing harm through supernatural means was a real and terrifying crime. The symptoms of ergotism, especially the convulsive form, fit the popular image of demonic possession and bewitchment perfectly. The writhing, the blasphemous shrieks, the hallucinations of monstrous creatures, what else could that be but the devil's work, carried out by his earthly servants? One afternoon, a group of village men, their faces grim and set, marched to Agnes' hut. You watch from a distance, your crotch digging into the soft earth. You feel a pang of something pity, fear, you're not sure. You've known Agnes your whole life. She gave your mother a poultice for a fever once, but you also saw her muttering near the rye fields just before the harvest. The fear inside you, the fear born of your own rotting flesh, is a powerful and persuasive voice. It wants someone to blame. The men drag her out. She is terrified, confused. Her protests a thin, reedy cry against their angry shouts. They bring her to the village square, to the same spot where the priest delivered his sermon. They accuse her of souring the milk, of causing the stillbirth of a calf, and now, of bringing this plague of fire upon them all. Here, we touch upon a dark and still debated chapter of history. Some modern scholars, most notably Lindor Copperrail in 1976, have put forward the theory that the Salem witch trials of 1690 may have been fueled, in part, by an outbreak of convulsive ergotism. The bewitched girls in Salem described symptoms: pins and needle sensations, feeling of being bitten or pinched, choking, visions that are remarkably consistent with the convulsive form of the sickness. While this theory is by no means universally accepted and many historians point to social and political factors as the primary cause, it highlights how easily the neurological chaos of ergotism could be misinterpreted as witchcraft in a pre-scientific society. Back in your village square, Agnes is surrounded. A young woman who has been suffering from the fits is brought forward. She points a trembling finger at Agnes and shrieks, "She sent her shadow beasts to choke me in my sleep. Her face was in my dreams." Laughing. Is the girl lying? Is she genuinely hallucinating? Is she simply caught up in the hysteria? In this moment, it doesn't matter. Her testimony is treated as irrefutable proof. Agnes, old and frail, denies everything, but her denials are taken as further evidence of her cunning. The fear in the village has curdled into a fever of righteousness. They have found their witch. They have found the source of their suffering. By punishing her, they believe they can break the curse. You watch as they bind her hands. The angry, fearful shouts of your neighbors echoing in the grey afternoon. You look down at your own ruined foot, and for a moment, you almost allow yourself to believe it. Maybe this will make it stop. The persecution of old Agnes does nothing to halt the spread of the sickness. Her fate, swift and brutal, leaves a stain on the village, a shared guilt that festers under the surface of the ongoing suffering. The fires still burn in people's limbs. The madness still seizes their minds, and so, blackening decay continues its inexorable march. The theory of witchcraft provided a moment of catharsis, a target for the village's rage, but it offered no cure. Hope, already a scarce commodity. begins to evaporate completely. It is in this atmosphere of utter hopelessness that a new word begins to circulate. It arrives with a traveling peddler, a man who has seen the same sickness in other towns and villages. You are sitting outside your hut, trying to catch a few weak rays of autumn sun, when you overhear him talking to the blacksmith. "It is the fire of St. Anthony," the peddler says, his voice low and solemn. "I saw it, you lion. Whole families consumed by it." The blacksmith, a man of practical muscle and little faith, just grunts. "Another saint. Father Martin has us praying to a dozen already. It does nothing." "Ah," the peddler says, leaning closer. "But this saint is different. He was a hermit, a desert father. He fought demons face to face in the Egyptians' hands. He knew the torment of the flesh and the terrors of the mind. He is the patron of those who suffer from fire, from plagues of the skin, from the devil's afflictions. The name is Saint Anthony the Great, an Egyptian hermit from the 3rd and 4th centuries. His story, or rather his legend, was one of epic spiritual warfare. It was said that he retreated to the desert to live a life of extreme asceticism, and there he was relentlessly tormented by demons. They appeared to him as monstrous beasts, as seductive women, and as armies of fiends who beat him mercilessly. Crucially for your situation, one of the torments they inflicted upon him was a magical, burning fire that consumed his body. Because he had endured and overcome this supernatural fire and these demonic visions, he became the saint to whom people prayed for relief from similar afflictions. This is a perfect example of the medieval logic of faith. There was a saint for everything. Saint Apollonia for toothaches, because her teeth were shattered during her martyrdom. Saint Blaise for throat ailments, because he saved a boy choking on a fishbone. So, for a disease that felt like a holy fire and caused demonic visions, who better to turn to than the saint who fought demons and was tormented by an unholy fire himself? The peddler continues, "They say the monks who follow the rule of Saint Anthony, they have a special grace. They can cool the fire. They can soothe the madness. Some even say they can halt the rot. A flicker of something you haven't felt in weeks sparks within you. It is not quite hope. It is too fragile for that. It is more like a possibility, a direction, a destination other than the grave." You pull yourself up on your crutch and limp over to the peddler. "These monks," you asked, your voice hoarse from disuse, "where are they?" The peddler looks at your wrapped foot, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "There is a hospice, a hospital, dedicated to the saint. It is a long journey from here, many leagues to the south. It is run by the Hospital Brothers of St. Anthony." He is referring to the Antonine Order, a congregation of monks founded in the late 11th century specifically to care for victims of St. Anthony's fire. The order's founding is a story in itself. Legend has it that a young French nobleman who contracted the disease was miraculously cured after his father prayed before the relics of Saint Anthony. In gratitude, he founded a hospital, and soon, the Antonine Order grew, establishing hospices all across Europe. These were some of the very first specialized hospitals in history, dedicated to treating a single, terrifying disease. The peddler offers you no guarantees. The journey is hard, he warns. Many perish on the road. But to stay here, he gestures vaguely at the shuttered huts around you, from which the sounds of suffering quietly leak. To stay here is to accept death. That evening, you make a decision. You sit with your wife in the dim light of a single tallow candle. You tell her what you heard. You tell her you are going to try to reach this hospice of St. Anthony. It is a desperate gamble. You are weak. You have a foot that is more dead than alive. The journey will be perilous, filled with bandits, bad weather, and the general hardship of medieval travel. But for the first time in a long time, there is a narrative other than sin, witchcraft, and decay. There is the story of a journey, a pilgrimage, a quest for a miracle. It is a story that offers agency, a chance to do something other than simply wait for the end. Your wife looks at you, her face etched with worry, but she nods. To do nothing is to surrender. To walk towards a distant, glimmering hope, however faint, is to fight back. You will leave tomorrow at dawn. You will go in search of the saint of burning souls. Dawn breaks, not with a brilliant burst of color, but as a slow dilution of the night's deep gray. The air is cold and bites at your exposed skin. You stand at the edge of the village, a small, pathetic bundle of belongings slung over your shoulder. Inside is a piece of hard cheese, a small water skin, and the last of your family has spread the very bread that poisoned you, but you have nothing else. The irony is a bitter taste in your mouth. Your wife and children stand before you. There are no dramatic farewells, no soaring speeches. Your goodbyes are a quiet, desperate affair, spoken in the universal language of fear and love. You hug your children, trying to be strong, trying not to let them see the terror in your eyes. You look at your wife, and a silent understanding passes between you. This may be the last time you ever see each other. You are walking away from everything you know, not towards a certain cure, but towards a fragile rumor of one. You are not the only one leaving. A small, wretched procession assembles at the village crossroads. There is a young woman, her mind clearly shattered, led by her stoic, heartbroken father. There is a man about your age, his hands blackened and curled into useless claws. An older woman is carried on a crude litter by her two sons. Her moans are constant, low thrum of agony. You are a fellowship of the damned, a small tribe of the afflicted, bound together by a shared torment and a single, desperate hope. You turn your back on your home and take the first, painful step. The crude crutch sinks into the mud, and your ruined foot sends a jolt of foul, throbbing pain up your leg. Every step is an effort of will. The road is not a road in any modern sense. It is a deeply rotted track, a mire of mud and animal waste. Wagons, horses, and generations of trudging feet have turned it into a treacherous landscape of its own. The world outside your village is vast and intimidating. The familiar fields and streams give way to dark, tangled forests and wide, empty plains. The silence of the countryside is unnerving, broken only by the cry of a distant bird or the rustle of some unseen creature in the undergrowth. This is a world without maps, without signposts. You navigate by rumor and the position of the sun. Follow this track until you cross the river with the broken bridge. Then bear south towards the Twin Hills. That is the extent of your directions. This journey highlights the profound isolation of medieval life. For most people, the world was their village in the few miles of surrounding farmland. A journey of 50 or 100 miles was an epic undertaking, a voyage into an unknown and dangerous world. You are not just traveling across a landscape, you are traveling across a psychological boundary, into a world of strangers. As you travel, you become a spectacle. People in the villages you pass through stop and stare. They see your rags, your crotches, your blackened limbs. They see the madness in the young woman's eyes. They cross themselves and hurry their children indoors. You are visibly cursed. They fear your affliction is contagious. The belief that, while medically incorrect for ergotism, was a perfectly rational fear in an age of leprosy and other communicable diseases. Doors are shut in your faces. You are denied food, water, and shelter. You sleep in barns if you're lucky, in cold, wet ditches if you're not. The small community of sufferers is your only solace. At night, huddled around a meager fire, you share your stories. You compare the nature of your fire, the patterns of your madness, the progress of your decay. A man from a village to the east speaks of a slightly different affliction, one that caused his joints to swell and seize up before the burning began, a small detail, but one that points to the incredible variability of the disease, a puzzle that vexed observers for centuries. You learn that what you thought was your private, unique torment is a shared script of suffering being played out across the land. The journey breaks you down. The physical toll is immense. Your could legates with the strain of overcompensation. Sores develop on your hands from the rough crutch. But the psychological toll is worse. The initial spark of hope gutters and flickers. The hospice of Saint Anthony begins to feel less like a real place and more like a fever dream, a mythical destination that recedes as you approach it. One night, the old woman on the litter quietly passes away. Her sons bury her by the side of the road, marking the spot with a small pile of stones. Her death is a stark, silent reminder of the stakes. You are in a race against the decay in your own body. You look down at your foot. The blackness, you're sure, has crept a little further up your ankle. You grip your crutch and force yourself onward. After weeks on the road, weeks that have blurred into a single, monotonous grey of pain and exhaustion, you see it. From the crest of a low hill, you look down into a river valley. Nestled by the water is a collection of stone buildings, larger and more orderly than any you have seen before. There is a church with a tall, slender spire, and next to it, a long, low building with a red tiled roof. A well-tended garden and a small orchard surround the complex. Flying from a flagpole is a banner you don't recognize. It is dark blue, with a symbol that looks like the Greek letter tau, a T-shaped cross. This is it, the hospice of the Antonine monks. Your small group of pilgrims quickens its pace, a new energy born of desperation flowing through your weary limbs. As you get closer, you see the place as a hive of activity. People are coming and going. Some, like you, are ragged and afflicted, limping or being carried. Others are hale and hearty-looking monks in dark robes, their faces serene and purposeful. You pass through an arched gateway into a courtyard. The air inside the walls feels different. It is calm. The sounds of suffering are still here. You can hear a cry of pain from an open window, but it is not the chaotic, panicked misery of your village. It is an ordered, managed suffering. A monk approaches you. He is older, with a kind, weathered face. He doesn't shrink back from your appearance. He doesn't cross himself or mutter a prayer. He simply looks at you, his eyes taking in your crutch, your ragged clothes, and the telltale shape of your wrapped foot. His gaze is not one of judgment, but of diagnosis. He has seen this 1,000 times before. "Welcome, brother," he says, his voice calm and gentle. "You have come to the house of Saint Anthony. Here you will find rest." He leads you inside the long building. You are in a great hall, a mood. The scale of it takes your breath away. Rows of simple wooden beds line the walls, far more than you could have imagined, and nearly every bed is occupied. You see the full, terrible spectrum of the disease gathered in one place. In one bed, a man thrashes in the throes of a convulsive fit. In another, a young boy stares at the ceiling, his hands and feet entirely black. A woman weeps quietly, cradling an arm that ends in a swaddle of bandages. The air is thick with the scent of sickness, but also of something else. Incense and medicinal herbs. This was the reality of the Antonine hospices. They were not places of quiet contemplation. They were frontline hospitals in a centuries-long war against a single disease. Historical records show these hospices were often overwhelmed, with patients lying 2 or 3 to a bed. The monks were not just spiritual guides. They were nurses, surgeons, and palliative care specialists in an age before any of those terms existed. The monk leads you to an empty bed. The mattress is stuffed with fresh, clean straw. The blanket, though coarse, is not threadbare. It is the most comfort you have known in months. Another monk comes with a basin of warm water and gently, skillfully, begins to unwrap the rags from your foot. You flinch, expecting a gasp of horror or a word of disgust. There is none. He cleans the oozing sores around the line of demarcation between living and dead tissue with a quiet efficiency. He applies a poultice that smells of wine and herbs and wraps your foot in clean linen bandages. The simple act of being cared for, of being touched without fear or revulsion, is so overwhelming that you find tears welling in your eyes. The monks' remedies were a mixture of folk medicine, rudimentary surgery, and powerful faith. One of their most famous treatments was a holy wine concoction called Saint Vinage. made by steeping a variety of herbs in wine and then pouring the mixture over the relics of Saint Anthony. Patients would then drink this blessed wine. Was it the herbs, the alcohol, the placebo effect of consuming a sacred substance, or something else entirely? Scholars still debate the efficacy of these specific treatments, but the overall success of the Antonine hospitals is undeniable. The monk who first greeted you returns. "You are safe now," he says. "Rest. We will bring you food and drink. Your pilgrimage is over." Your healing begins. You lie back on the straw mattress, the clean bandage on your foot a small beacon of hope. For the first time, you are in a place where your sickness is not seen as a sign of sin or a mark of witchcraft. Here, it is simply an illness to be fought. Around you, the symphony of suffering continues, but for the first time in a very long time, you do not feel entirely alone in it. Your first few days at the hospice are a blur of sleep and gentle care. The sheer exhaustion from your journey, combined with the constant, grinding pain, had pushed you to the very edge of your endurance. Here, within these stone walls, you are granted a respite. Monks move through the ward with a quiet, practiced calm, changing dressings, offering sips of water, and speaking words of comfort. The atmosphere is one of disciplined compassion. But the most significant part of your treatment, the core of the Antonine therapy, is not in the poultices or the prayers. It begins on your first evening, when a monk brings you your supper. You are expecting a thin gruel, at best, a familiar slice of dark, heavy bread. Instead, he places a wooden bowl and a small platter in front of you. In the bowl is a thick, savory stew, rich with vegetables you haven't seen in months. And on the platter is something you have only ever seen on the Lord's table at feast days. It is bread, but it is unlike any bread you have ever eaten. It is white, not the brownish grey of rye, but a soft, pale cream color. You pick it up. It's light, dairy. The crust is a golden brown and flakes under your fingers. You take a bite, and the taste is a revelation. It's mild, slightly sweet, without the familiar sour, earthy tang of your daily bread. This is wheaten bread, the bread of the wealthy, the bread of kings. Along with the bread, the monk gives you a small cup of dark red wine. It is strong and slightly sweet. "Eat," he says. "Drink. This is the bread of Saint Anthony. This is his wine. It will cool the fire." You devour the meal. It is the most satisfying food you have ever tasted, not just for its flavor, but because it feels clean, pure, and you notice, after a few hours, that the deep, throbbing ache in your leg seems to have subsided. Just a little. The burning sensation, which usually returns with a vengeance at night, is a duller, more distant heat. You sleep more soundly that night than you have in months. The next day, and every day after, the diet is the same. Good, clean water, rich vegetable stews, sometimes with a bit of meat, and always the pure, white wheaten bread and the red wine. And day by day, you begin to feel a change. The fire in your limb recedes. The terrible visions that sometimes plagued your sleep become less frequent. The crawling sensation under your skin disappears. You are witnessing, without understanding, the cure. The secret to the Antonine monks' success was not their prayers or their holy relics, though these certainly provided immense psychological comfort. Their secret weapon was diet. By taking you away from your village, they had taken you away from the source of the poison, the ergot-contaminated rye. By feeding you bread made from wheat grain that is far less susceptible to the ergot fungus, they had effectively stopped the daily ingestion of the toxins. This is a point of fascinating historical irony. The cure was astonishingly simple. Just eat different food. But in the rigid, feudal structure of the medieval world, this was a solution that was socially and economically impossible for you to discover on your own. Your village grew rye because that's what the soil would support. You ate rye because that's all you had. The monks, with their large, well-funded monastic estates, had access to better land and could afford to grow and mill wheat. The cure for the peasant's disease was, quite literally, to eat like a lord. And what about the wine? Scholars are still intrigued by the role of the famous Saint Vinage. While the blessings were for the soul, the wine itself may have had a physiological effect. Many of the ergot alkaloids are vasoxanthocase, meaning they tighten blood vessels. Alcohol is a vasodilator. It relaxes and widens them. It is entirely plausible that the daily dose of wine was helping to counteract the effects of the poison, improving blood flow to your damaged limbs and easing the pain. Of course, the monks themselves probably did not understand the precise pharmacological mechanism at play. They were operating on a principle of observation and tradition. They knew that their regimen removing patients from their homes and providing this specific diet worked. They attributed this success to the grace of their patron saint. To them, faith and medicine were not separate fields. The white bread was pure, and therefore holy. The rye was tainted, and therefore cursed. It was a perfect fusion of theological belief and effective medical practice. You cannot save your blackened foot. The tissue is too far gone, too dead to be revived. The monks will eventually have to perform a crude amputation to prevent the spread of infection. But they have saved your life. They have stopped the poison. They have cooled the fire. And they did it not with a miraculous incantation, but with a simple loaf of bread. As you slowly regain some strength in the Antonine Hospice, your world, which had shrunk to the confines of your own body and its torment, begins to expand again. You listen to the stories of the other patients, the tales brought by traveling monks and pilgrims. You begin to understand that what happened to your village was not an isolated event. It was a single, tiny brushstroke in a much larger, more terrifying masterpiece of suffering. A monk, a learned man named Brother Michael who helped tend to your dressings, tells you about the Great Scourge. He speaks of the year 994, a year that lives on in the chronicles of their order as a time of unparalleled horror. It was in the south, in Aquitaine, he says. His voice low as he carefully wraps your leg with fresh linen. The rains that year were relentless. The harvest was black with despair. The fire came upon the people with a fury no one had ever seen. You are being transported back in time, to an event that occurred long before your birth but is a foundational part of the history of your disease. The outbreak of 994 in France was not a village-level affliction. It was an epidemic of catastrophic proportions. It swept across the regions of Aquitaine and the Limousin, a wave of agony and death that crashed over the population. Contemporary chroniclers of the time, like the monk Adhemard Echebanus, described scenes of apocalyptic horror. His words, passed down through generations of monks, paint a vivid picture. He wrote of people crowding into churches, their shrieks echoing off the stone walls. He described limbs, blackened and withered, falling from bodies in the middle of the street. He wrote of a foul stench that hung over entire towns, the smell of rotting flesh. He claimed that the fields were littered with the dead and the dying. 40,000, Brother Michael whispers, the number so large you can barely comprehend it. The chroniclers say that 40,000 souls were taken by the fire in that one year, in that one region. While medieval numbers are notoriously difficult to verify, and often prone to exaggeration, the sheer scale of the 994 epidemic is not in doubt. It was a public health crisis on a level with the Great Plagues. Imagine your small village, with its dozen or so victims, and multiply that horror by 1,000. Imagine entire regions where a significant portion of the population was either dead, dying, or racked with agonizing pain and madness. This massive outbreak was the catalyst that led directly to the founding of the Antonine Order. It was a tragedy so immense that it demanded a response, and the veneration of Saint Anthony's relics as a source of healing exploded in popularity. The sheer number of victims created a need for specialized care that the existing system's local healers, monasteries, and family could not possibly handle. Brother Michael tells you that this is the nature of the fire. It is a disease of seasons and cycles. It lies dormant for years, appearing only sporadically, claiming a family here, a hamlet there. Then, When the conditions are just right, a wet spring, a cool and damp summer, it explodes. It becomes a regional terror. Historians and climatologists today can track major ergotism outbreaks in Europe and see how they correlate with periods of unusual weather, particularly cool, wet growing seasons that favor the proliferation of the CL. Avisps purpurea fungus. He also explains something that resonates with your own experience. The scourge of 994, like all the outbreaks, was a poor man's plague. He gestures around the ward. Look at the beds. Do you see any lords? Any wealthy merchants? Any bishops? No. You see farmers, laborers, weavers, people who live by the rye. This observation, so obvious once stated, had been a key feature of the disease for centuries. It followed the fault lines of the feudal economy. It was a class-based ailment. The rich ate wheat. They drank wine regularly. Their very diet, rich in vitamins, may have also offered some protection. The poor ate rye. They drank water or thin ale. Their diet was monotonous and often nutritionally deficient. The disease was a brutal, physical manifestation of the social hierarchy. You lie on your cot, the number 40,000 echoing in your mind. Your personal tragedy, which had felt so singular and so cosmic, is now contextuated. You are not a unique sinner being punished by God. You are one of thousands upon thousands of victims of a recurring, agricultural horror. Your suffering is not a divine judgment, but a consequence of the grain you eat, the land you farm, and the station you were born into. It is a terrifying thought, but in a strange way, it is also liberating. It lifts the burden of guilt, replacing it with a sense of shared, tragic history. You are part of a vast, silent brotherhood of suffering that stretches back for generations. The longer you stay at the hospice, the more the patterns of the disease become frighteningly clear. Brother Michael, the learned monk, becomes your informal teacher. He has seen hundreds of cases, and he has read the accounts of the brothers who came before him. He is a man of faith, but he is also a keen observer of the physical world. One afternoon, as you are sitting in the courtyard, learning to walk again with 2 crude crutches, you see a fine carriage arrive. It is a rare sight. A wealthy merchant, his face pale with worry, helps his wife out of the carriage. She is elegantly dressed, but her hands are trembling uncontrollably, and she speaks in a confused, frightened whisper. The monks led her not into the main ward with the rest of you, but to a separate, private chamber. You mention this to Brother Michael later. Does she have the fire? You ask. Brother Michael nods slowly. A mild case, and a very rare one. They were traveling through a poor region, and for several weeks, their cook was forced to buy local flour. Even the rich are not entirely immune. If they are careless, then he adds the crucial observation. But it is a fire they can easily escape. They will stay here for a while, eating our bread. Then they will go home, back to their own kitchens, their own fine wheaten flour, and they will likely never be troubled again. He gestures with his chin towards the main ward, where the sounds of moaning and coughing from a constant, no chorus, for us. He says, including you and the us. It is different. We can be cured here. But then what? We go back to the same villages, to the same fields of rye, and we pray that the next harvest is not a wet one. This is the grim reality of Street Anthony's fire. It was a disease deeply stratified by class. The line between sickness and health was often the line between rye and wheat. This wasn't a matter of conspiracy or malice. It was a simple, brutal economic fact. Wheat was a more demanding crop. It required better soil, more favorable conditions. It produced a lower yield per acre than rye. Therefore, it was more expensive. It was a cash crop, something a lord or a wealthy monastery grew to sell. Rye was a subsistence crop, a stubborn, reliable grain that could grow in the marginal lands where the peasantry lived. You are living through a form of inadvertent, slow-motion class warfare waged by a fungus. The wealthy, with their diverse diets and their access to clean grain, were almost entirely protected. Their bodies were never exposed to the steady, low-level dosing of ergot alkaloids. There is a fascinating and somewhat macabre exception to this rule that historians have noted. Sometimes, a nobleman or a wealthy bishop would contract the disease. Often, during a famine or a siege, when their own private stores of wheat ran out and they were forced to eat the same rye bread as the common soldiers and citizens. Their sudden vulnerability was a stark reminder of how thin the veneer of their privilege truly was. When forced to eat from the common loaf, they suffered the common man's fate. Furthermore, there was a concept in medieval Europe known as the Great Chain of Being, a divinely ordered social hierarchy. The king was at the top, followed by nobles, clergy, merchants, and at the very bottom, the peasantry. Each person had their place. This worldview, scholars argue, may have made it harder to see the truth. The fact that the disease primarily struck the lowest rung of the ladder was not seen as a clue to its environmental cause. Instead, it was often interpreted as a confirmation of the natural order. The poor were seen as more sinful, more ignorant, and therefore more susceptible to divine punishment or demonic influence. Their sickness was a reflection of their lowly state. You look down at your own hands, calloused from years of farm work. You think of the lord of your manor, a man you have only seen from a distance, riding a fine horse, his clothes made of dyed wool and fur. You have never resented him. That is simply the way of the world. He was born to rule. You were born to work the land. But now, you see that the very structure of your world, the division of land and labor, is what condemned you. Your poverty was a pre-existing condition. The fungus was just the agent that exploited it. The merchant and his wife leave after 2 weeks. They make a generous donation to the hospice. You watch their carriage disappear down the road. Back to a world of comfort and safety. You will also leave, eventually. But you will be returning to a world of risk, where every wet harvest could bring the fire back. You have been cured of the poison, but you have not been cured of the poverty that exposed you to it. Your body is healing, but your mind is restless. The question of why still haunts you, but it's a different kind of why now. It's no longer the theological why have I been punished, but a more practical, more scientific why did this happen. You spend hours talking with Brother Michael, who, for a medieval monk, has a remarkably inquisitive and observational mind. He doesn't just accept that the disease is a curse. He is fascinated by its mechanics, its patterns, its triggers. The old physicians, the ones who follow the teachings of the Greeks, they speak of the 4 humors. Brother Michael tells you one afternoon as he pounds earth with a mortar and pestle, they would say this fire is an excess of yellow bile, an imbalance in the body's natural state. But that doesn't explain why it strikes one village and not the next, or why it rages in a wet year and sleeps in a dry one. He is pointing to the absolute inadequacy of classical and medieval medicine in the face of ergotism. The humoral theory, which posited that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids blood, yellow bile, and black bile, was the dominant medical paradigm for over 1,000 years. A physician of the time might have tried to treat you with bloodletting to remove excess humus, or prescribed a diet of cool foods like cucumbers to counteract the hot disease. These treatments were, at best, useless and, at worst, harmful. Some of our brothers, he continues, wiping the pestle clean, have other theories. Brother Jim, who spent time at hospice in the Rhine Valley, was convinced it was caused by a mist, a vapor that rises from the ground when the rye is in bloom, a poisonous air. This is the miasma theory of disease, another incredibly persistent and long-lived idea, from the Black Death to the cholera outbreaks of the 19th century. Diseases were often blamed on bad air, foul-smelling fogs, mists, or vapors rising from swamps, graveyards, or decaying organic matter. The word malaria itself comes from the Italian for bad air malaria. In a way, the miasma theorists were tantalizingly close to the truth. They had correctly identified an environmental component. They noticed that the disease was tied to a specific place and a specific season. Their mistake was in blaming the air rather than the food grown in that environment. It's a perfect example of correlation being mistaken for causation. You can almost picture Brother Jean, a medieval disease detective, standing in a damp rye field, seeing the morning mist, and coming to a perfectly logical, yet completely wrong, conclusion. Then there is the theory of cursed soil. Michael adds, some believe that certain fields are tainted, perhaps by the burial of a sinner or by a pagan curse from the old days. They say that anything grown in that soil carries the curse with it and transmits it to those who eat it. Again, this is a fascinating near miss. The core idea that the source of the sickness comes from the earth of a specific field is correct. The ergot fungus, Cella vispias purpurea, overwinters in the soil as a hard, resilient structure called SC Ellerotium, the very purple black kernel you harvested. In the spring, this SC Ellerotium sprouts tiny, mushroom-like bodies that release spores, which are then carried by the wind to infect the flowering rye plants. So the fields were, in a very real sense, cursed. The curse wasn't supernatural, but biological. It was a cycle of infection, year after year, regenerating from the soil itself. The debate among these early thinkers' humoral imbalances. Miasma is. Cursed earth is a wonderful illustration of the scientific process in its infancy. They were observing, forming hypotheses, and trying to find patterns in the chaos. They were working without the tools of modern science, without microscopes or knowledge of chemistry or biology. Their theories seem strange to us now, but they were the product of intelligent minds trying to make sense of a terrifying and inexplicable world. The history of science is not just a history of being right. It's also a rich and fascinating history of all the creative and logical ways we've been wrong. And it is this very debate that continues to occupy scholars today, not about the cause, which we now know, but about what people in your time truly believe. Did the average peasant simply accept the priest's explanation of divine wrath, or were there complex, coexisting folk theories about bad air and tainted grain? It's almost certain that these ideas, divine, magical, and proto-scientific, all swirled together, creating a complex and often contradictory tapestry of belief. You sit there, listening to Brother Michael, and you feel a strange sense of intellectual vertigo. You are caught between worlds. The world of sin and saints that has governed your whole life, and this new world of observation, of cause and effect, of bad air and cursed soil. You don't have the answer. Brother Michael doesn't have the answer, but for the first time, you feel you are finally asking the right questions. The mystery is no longer who has angered God, but where does the fire come from? Your physical recovery continues, but your conversations with Brother Michael have opened a new door in your mind. You begin to see connections, echoes of your village's suffering in other historical tales and local legends. One day, a pilgrim on his way to a distant shrine stays at the hospice. He is a storyteller, a collector of strange tales from the road, huddled by the fire in the hospice kitchen. He speaks of a village he passed through years ago, far to the north, near the German lands. It was the strangest sight, he says, his eyes wide with the memory. The whole village, dozens of people, were in the streets. They were dancing, but it was not a joyful dance. They leapt and twitched, their arms flailing. Their faces were slick with sweat and twisted in agony. They could not stop. They danced until they collapsed from exhaustion, some until their hearts burst in their chests. You listen, captivated and horrified. The story sounds fantastical, a fable, but then he adds a detail that makes the hair on your arms stand up. And as they danced, many of them screamed of fires in their bellies and of demons chasing them. The storyteller is describing one of the most bizarre and terrifying phenomena of the Middle Ages, the dancing plagues, called Choro Mondier. The most famous of these outbreaks occurred in Aachen in 1374 and in Strasbourg in 1518, where a woman named Frau Trophier began dancing uncontrollably in the street. And within a month, Hundreds had joined her. Contemporary accounts describe a scene of mass hysteria, a frantic, joyless, and often fatal dance marathon. For centuries, these events were a historical enigma. Explanations ranged from demonic possession to a shared psychological delusion brought on by the immense stress and hardship of medieval life. But in recent decades, a compelling, though fiercely debated, theory has emerged that some of these dancing plagues may have been outbreaks of convulsive ergotism. The symptoms are a striking match. The muscle spasms, twitching, and uncontrolled movements could easily be described as a grotesque dance. The hallucinations, the feeling of burning, the manic energy, it all lines perfectly with the neurological chaos induced by the ergot alkaloids. Imagine a whole village, already on edge from famine and poverty, consuming tainted rye. A few people begin to exhibit the convulsive symptoms. In the highly superstitious and suggestible atmosphere of the time, the sight of their neighbors' frantic, uncontrolled movements could trigger a wave of mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria, blurring the line between a biological trigger and a psychological contagion. This is a point where history becomes a fascinating and complex puzzle, and scholars are still arguing about the pieces. Was the stress-bored dancing plague of 1518 really ergotism? The historical records are ambiguous. Some accounts mention that the authorities, believing the dancers were suffering from hot blood, encouraged them to keep dancing by clearing open spaces and even hiring musicians. This would be a bizarre and counterproductive response to a poisoning, suggesting that at least some observers saw it as a different kind of malady. However, other historical possessions and mass hysteria as fit the ergotism profile even more closely. The bizarre case of the bewitched children of Amsterdam in 1566, who contorted their bodies, climbed walls, and spoke in strange voices, has also been re-examined through the lens of ergot poisoning. It's possible that ergotism was the hidden biological engine driving many of these seemingly supernatural events. It might not be the sole explanation for all of them, but it provides a plausible physiological basis for behavior that was otherwise inexplicable to medieval minds. You think back to your own village, to the young woman you saw spinning in circles, laughing and shrieking, to your neighbor Thomas, thrashing in the mud. Was he having a seizure? Or was he dancing? From a certain perspective, the line is blurry. His movements were rhythmic in their violence, a convulsive dance with an invisible, demonic purpose. The storyteller finishes his tale, and the kitchen is quiet for a moment. The only sound the crackling of the fire. You realize that the fire and the madness that you thought of as two separate plagues might be even more deeply intertwined. The convulsive form wasn't just seizures. It could manifest as a whole range of bizarre, seemingly choreographed behaviors. The poison in the bread didn't just burn your limbs. It could hijack the body and turn it into a puppet, forced to perform a final, agonizing dance. The story adds another layer of terror to the fungus you now know is your enemy. It is a poison with 1,000 faces, a monster capable of infinite and terrifying variety. The pilgrim's story about the dancing plague plants a disturbing seed in your mind. If the poison from the bread could make people dance uncontrollably, what else could it make them do? What else could it make them see? The connection between the convulsive fits and the whispers of witchcraft in your own village suddenly clicks into place with a dreadful clarity. You think back to the trial of old Agnes. You remember the young woman, her body still trembling from a recent fit, pointing at Agnes and screaming about shadow beasts and seeing the old woman's face laughing in her dreams. At the time, in the grip of fear, her testimony seemed like irrefutable proof of witchcraft. Now, you see it in a chilling new light. The girl wasn't necessarily lying. She probably did see those things. The shadow beasts were not sent by Agnes. They were born from the poison in her own mind. You are stumbling upon a realization that has become a significant, though still contentious, area of historical study. The potential role of ergotism in the history of witchcraft accusations. The symptoms of convulsive ergotism read like a checklist for demonic possession or bewitchment as it was understood in the medieval and early modern periods. Consider the classic signs of being bewitched, as described in countless trial records and witch hunting manuals. The victim often feels a pricking or biting sensation on their skin, as if being tormented by invisible imps. This aligns perfectly with the paresthesia of early-stage ergotism, the pins and needles, the crawling sensations. You remember that feeling all too well. The victims would then often go into violent contortions and fits, their bodies bending into unnatural positions, their mouths foaming. They would cry out in pain, claiming to be choked, burned, or pinched by spectral forces. This is a near-perfect description of an ergot-induced seizure. And then there were the visions. The hallucinogenic properties of some ergot alkaloids could conjure terrifyingly vivid nightmares and waking hallucinations. Accusers would describe seeing the witch in their room at night, accompanied by demonic animals or flying on a broomstick. These weren't necessarily malicious lies. They may have been genuine, toxin-induced hallucinations, as real to the sufferer as the bed they were lying in. The brain, under chemical assault, was simply projecting its deepest cultural fears into reality. The witch wasn't the cause of the visions. The visions created the witch. This provides a terrifyingly plausible mechanism for how a witchcraft accusation could begin and spread. Imagine you are a child in a poor, rural family. You eat rye bread every day. You start to feel the tingling, the crawling sensations. Then the muscle cramps and spasms begin. At night, you have terrifying nightmares that bleed into your waking hours. You see the face of a neighbor, perhaps an unpopular old woman like Agnes, slouching in the corner of the room. You tell your parents. They, steeped in a world of supernatural belief, see not the symptoms of a foodborne illness, but the clear and undeniable signs of malefic IUM. The theory gained its most famous foothold, as you've heard, in attempts to explain the Salem witch trials of 1692. The accusers, mostly a group of young girls, displayed a whole host of symptoms: fits, temporary blindness and deafness, a feeling of being choked that could plausibly be linked to ergotism. The region had experienced a damp growing season, and the primary grain was rye. While many historians now believe that social and psychological factors were more significant in Salem, the ergotism theory remains a powerful reminder of how a biological event can be filtered through a cultural lens and emerge as something else entirely. Whether or not ergotism was the definitive cause in Salem or other specific witch trials is a matter of ongoing academic debate. Proving a specific historical outbreak is incredibly difficult without physical evidence. But the broader principle is what matters. Ergotism provides a powerful physiological model for what bewitchment looked like. It shows how a whole community could, in good faith, become convinced it was under supernatural assault, all because of a microscopic fungus growing on their staple food. You look around the hospice ward. You see the twitching limbs. You hear the delirious cries. Each one of these symptoms, in another context, could be a nail in an innocent person's coffin. Your neighbor Thomas, in his violent convulsions, could have been seen as possessed. The young girl, in her manic visions, could have been a witch's accuser. You, with your burning limbs and blackened flesh, could have been seen as a sinner suffering under a witch's curse. The fungus wasn't just a poison, it was a perfect and terrible engine for generating fear, suspicion, and injustice. It created its own villains. Months pass, the seasons turn, the harsh winds of autumn give way to the deep, biting cold of winter. Inside the hospice, life continues in its own steady rhythm of care and prayer. Your amputated leg has healed into a neat stump. You are stronger now, able to move around the monastery grounds with surprising agility on your crutches. The fire is gone, the tingling a distant memory. Your mind is clear. You are, for all intents and purposes, cured. But the mystery of the disease, the intellectual puzzle you and Brother Michael have been slowly assembling, remains unsolved. All your theories, the divine punishment, the miasma, the cursed soil, are just stories, attempts to draw a map of a dark and unknown territory. You know the cure is to stop eating your home's bread. But the ultimate cause, the first link in the chain of suffering, is still a ghost. Your story now takes a great leap forward in time. You must leave the smoky, uncertain world of your medieval hospice and travel through the centuries. Imagine your spirit drifting through the years, watching as the same terrible scenes play out, again and again. You see outbreaks in Germany in the 1500 seconds, in France in the 1600 seconds, the same burning limbs, the same madness, the same desperate prayers to Saint Anthony. The world is changing, new clothes, new buildings, new ideas, but the ancient scourge remains, a stubborn and terrifying constant. You come to rest in the year 1676. In France, the world here is different. People are reading printed books. Men in wigs and fine coats are looking through brass microscopes and telescopes, trying to unravel the secrets of the universe. It is the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment. And in this world, a French physician named Dr. Tranquil is practicing in the Solarny region, which is suffering through a terrible outbreak of street and thorny's fire. Dr. Tranquil is a modern man, a man of science and observation. Like Brother Michael, he is a keen observer, but he has tools and a framework of thought that your monk friend could only dream of. He is not satisfied with the explanation of divine wrath. He too notices the stark class division of the disease. The sickness, he writes in his notes, which will become a crucial document in the history of medicine, only afflicts the poorest country folk. The rich of the towns, and even the priests and governors who live amongst the poor but eat differently, are entirely spared. This is not a new observation. Of course, Brother Michael knew this. The Antonine monks had based their entire cure upon it for centuries. But Dr. Tranquil takes the next, crucial, logical step. He doesn't just note the correlation, he investigates the cause with a relentless focus. What is the single, defining difference between the diet of the rich and the diet of the poor in this region? He examines their food. The rich eat bread made from wheat. The poor, he notes, eat a dark, purplish bread made from rye, and he observes that this rye is often contaminated with a kind of long, black, or night growth, which the locals call ergot, an old French word for a rooster's spur, which it resembles. This is the moment. The eureka moment. It's not the rye itself that is the problem. It is the thing growing on the rye. For the first time, the blame is explicitly and scientifically shifted from the grain to the fungus. Dr. Tranquil is the first to state, with medical authority, that the black spurs and the terrible disease are cause and effect. It seems so simple, so obvious in retrospect. But it was a monumental leap of inductive reasoning. For 1,000 years, people had seen the ergot on their rye. For 1,000 years, they had suffered the fire. But connecting the two with certainty, separating the fungus from the grain it grew on, required a new way of thinking. It required a mind willing to dismiss centuries of superstition and look for a simple, physical cause. However, the history of science is rarely a straight line. Dr. Tranquil published his findings, but his theory was not immediately or universally accepted. Old ideas die hard. Many physicians continued to believe in miasmas or humoral imbalances. The academic debate was fierce. Some argued that the ergot was merely a sign of a blighted, unhealthy plant, and that the poison was in the rye grain itself, which had gone bad because of the wet weather. The idea that such a tiny fungus could produce such a powerful and devastating poison was, to some, unbelievable. It's a classic example of a paradigm shift. Tranquil's idea was revolutionary, and like many revolutionary ideas, it was met with resistance and skepticism. It would take more studies, more evidence, and more outbreaks before the medical establishment as a whole would finally accept the truth. But for you, this moment is a profound release. The ghost has a name. The monster has been unmasked. The invisible enemy that has tormented your people for a millennium is a small, purple-black fungus. The curse is not in your soul, not in the air, not in the soil. It is in the bread. It has always been in the bread. Dr. Thu Lear gave the enemy a face, linking the rooster's spur in the field to the fire in the limb. But the true nature of that enemy remained a profound mystery. What was this strange, dark growth? Was it a diseased part of the rye plant itself? A strange root? A dried-up worm? To truly understand the monster, you needed not just a keen eye, but a magical one, an eye that could see into a world hidden within the world. Your journey through time continues, moving forward from the 17th century into the 18th and 19th. This is an era of revolutions, not just in politics, but in science. The microscope, once a novelty for curious gentlemen, is becoming a serious tool for scientific inquiry, and under its lens, the fundamental nature of life is being revealed. You arrive in the year 1853, in the laboratory of a French botanist named Louis-René Tillet. He is a mycologist, a strange and specialized sort of scientist who devotes his life to the study of fungi, mold, mildews, mushrooms, and rusts. To most people of his time, fungi are a minor, often disgusting, nuisance. Tillet sees them as a hidden kingdom of life, as complex and fascinating as plants or animals. And on his workbench, under the brass and glass of his microscope, is a specimen of ergot. He carefully slices away for a thin section of the heart. Black Erotium, the very same rice spur you once held in your hand in that damp field. He places it on a glass slide. He adjusts the mirror to catch the light, leans forward, and peers through the eyepiece. And in that moment, the monster's truth is revealed. What he sees is not the tissue of a plant. It is a dense, tightly woven matted thread like filaments. These are hyphae, the building blocks of a fungus. He has just proven, definitively, that ergot is not a part of the rye plant, but a separate organism that is parasitizing it. He gives this tiny monster its formal, scientific name, its true name, Calavispius purpurea. Calavispius, meaning club-headed, for the shape of its spore-producing structures, purpurea, for its distinctive purple color. But Tillet doesn't stop there. Through patient, meticulous observation over several seasons, he works out the fungus's entire, diabolical life cycle. He is the first person to understand the full story. He sees how the fungus survives the winter as the hard, black SC Erotium in the soil. He watches as this SC Erotium, in the damp of spring, sprouts tiny, mushroom-like stalks. Through his microscope, he sees these stalks release clouds of microscopic spores, which are carried on the wind like an invisible army. He observes how these spores land on the flowering heads of young rye plants. He watches, fascinated, as a spore germinates, sending a fungal thread down into the base of the flower, the ovary, where a grain of rye is supposed to fall. This is the moment of infection, the biological equivalent of a demonic possession. The fungus then does something truly insidious. It secretes a sticky, sweet nectar called honeydew, which oozes out of the infected flower. This nectar is filled with a second type of spore. Tillet watches as insects, attracted to the sweet liquid, come to feed. They fly from one rye flower to another, their legs and bodies covered in the sticky, spore-laden nectar, spreading the infection throughout the entire field. The fungus is using the insects, turning them into unwitting collaborators in its conquest. Finally, he observes the end game. The fungus, having consumed the rye ovary, grows and hardens, forming the familiar purple-black SC Erotium. The ergot, filled with nutrients stolen from its host plant. It is a perfect survival pod, ready to fall to the ground during harvest and begin the cycle all over again. This is a moment of profound scientific beauty and horror, a life cycle of such complexity and ruthless efficiency, all playing out on a scale too small for the naked eye to see. For 1,000 years, you and your ancestors had been battling not a curse or a miasma, but a highly evolved parasitic organism with a brilliant, multi-stage strategy for survival and propagation. The academic debate about this was not as fierce as the one that followed Dr. Thuld, but it still took time for Tullius and his findings to be fully accepted. The idea of a fungus having such a complex, multi-stage life cycle was novel and challenging to the established botanical science of the time. Some botanists initially argued that the different stages Tullius and he described were actually different, unrelated species of fungus that just happened to grow near each other. But his meticulous drawings and careful experiments eventually won the day. You stand, an invisible spectator in Tullius and his lab. The mystery is finally solved. The name is no. Calavispes purpurea. Its secret life is laid bare under the microscope's revealing gaze. The why is no longer a question of theology or superstition. It is a question of biology, a question of a tiny, deadly, and brutally efficient form of life, locked in an ancient dance of survival with the grain that you depend on for your own. Tullius unmasked the killer, revealing its biological identity and life cycle. But this only deepened the mystery. It was one thing to know that a fungus was responsible. It was another thing entirely to understand how could this tiny, inert-looking sliver of black matter wage such a devastating war on the human body? How could it burn, twist, and madden the most powerful creature on Earth? The next stage of your journey takes you into a world even more invisible than the one Tullius saw through his microscope. You are entering the world of molecules. You leap forward again, to the turn of the 20th century. Laboratories now are filled not just with microscopes, but with glassware, bubbling beakers, and strange chemical apparatuses. Scientists are no longer just observing life, they are deconstructing it. They are engaged in a new kind of alchemy, organic chemistry. They are isolating the very chemicals, the essences, that make living things work. And the ergot, the Calavispes purpurea sclerotium, becomes an object of intense fascination. It is a biological treasure chest, a known source of a potent, and potentially useful, physiological power. Chemists in Europe and America begin the painstaking process of grinding up the black horns, dissolving them in various solvents, filtering them, crystallizing them, trying to capture the poison in a pure, tangible form. In 1906, a British chemist named George Barger, along with his colleague Francis H. Kerr, finally isolates one of the active compounds. They name it ergotoxin. Soon after, other chemists isolate other, similar compounds. They discover that ergot is not just one poison, but a complex chemical factory. It produces a whole family of potent, nitrogen-containing molecules which they classify as alkaloids. This is the secret. These alkaloids are the microscopic bullets fired by the fungus. They are the invisible agents of all the suffering you witnessed and endured. And as scientists begin to study their effects on animal tissues, the entire gruesome picture of your disease becomes clear, molecule by molecule. They discover that the primary action of many of these alkaloids, like ergotamine isolated in 1918, is to mimic the effect of adrenaline on the smooth muscles of the body, particularly the muscles that line the walls of your blood vessels. They are incredibly potent vesicsanticus when you ate the tainted bread. These molecules entered your bloodstream. They found their way to the arteries and capillaries in your limbs. There, they locked onto cellular receptors, sending a relentless, false signal: constrict, tighten, clamp down. This explains the first tingle, the holy fire, and the black rot. It was a slow, chemical strangulation of your own tissues. The constant signal to constrict overcame your body's natural mechanisms for regulating blood flow. The vessels clamped shut, starving your nerves and muscles of oxygen, causing the pain and, eventually, the death of the tissue itself. But that's not all they found. They discovered that other alkaloids in the ergot cocktail had a different primary target: the central nervous system. These molecules were able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Once inside the brain, they caused absolute chaos. They interfered with crucial neurotransmitters, the chemicals your brain cells use to communicate with each other. particularly serotonin and dopamine. Imagine your brain as a fantastically complex switchboard with billions of signals flashing every second, keeping your thoughts, perceptions, and movements in perfect balance. Now imagine throwing a handful of chemical gravel into that switchboard. That's what the alkaloids did. They blocked some signals, amplified others, and created new, false signals out of nowhere. This chemical chaos explains the other side of your village's ordeal. The convulsions and seizures were the result of the brain's motor control centers firing wildly, sending a storm of nonsensical commands to the muscles. The terrifying hallucinations, the shadow beasts. The demons were the result of the visual cortex being hijacked, forced to generate images from a mixture of memory and fear. The madness, the babbling, the paranoia, all of it could be traced back to the disruption of these delicate chemical pathways that govern thought and emotion. The academic debate here is a subtle but fascinating one that continues to this day, concerning the exact blend of these alkaloids. Why did you get the gangrenous form while your neighbor Thomas got the convulsive? The answer likely lies in the precise ratio of vasoconstricting alkaloids to neurotropic alkaloids in the specific strain of fungus that grew in your field that year. Different strains of CLA vice purpurea, growing in different climates, produce different cocktails of poisons. Your bread was likely rich in ergotamine, leading to gangrene, Thomas' family. Perhaps eating bread from a different part of the harvest or a different field may have ingested a batch rich in the alkaloids that primarily attack the brain. You are witnessing the final, deepest level of the explanation. The horror that began with the wet harvest, that was interpreted as a divine curse, that was treated with prayer and white bread, has now been traced to its ultimate source, a specific molecule latching onto a specific receptor on a specific cell. The vast, terrifying mystery of street Anthony's fire has been reduced to a simple, elegant, and brutal chemical equation. A monster is not just a fungus. It is a molecule. The story of the ergot alkaloids, it turns out, is not just a story of poison. As the chemists of the early 20th century continued to isolate and purify these potent molecules, they discovered something remarkable. A poison, after all, is often just a medicine in a higher dose. The very properties that made these chemicals so destructive also made them potentially, incredibly, useful. Your journey now takes you from the academic laboratories into the world of modern pharmacology, the science of creating drugs. The same company that first isolated ergotamine, a Swiss chemical company named Sandoz, began to explore its therapeutic potential. They knew ergotamine was a powerful vasoconstrictor, so where in the human body might that effect be helpful? They found two critical applications. The first was in obstetrics. For centuries, midwives had known, through folk tradition, that a small, carefully controlled dose of ergot could be used to control bleeding after childbirth. The fungus that had brought so much death was also a bringer of life. The alkaloids would cause the uterus to contract powerfully, clamping down on the blood vessels and preventing a potentially fatal postpartum hemorrhage. Sandoz was able to create a standardized, purified, and safe version of this ancient folk remedy, a drug that would go on to save countless new mothers' lives. The second application was for a different kind of torment, the migraine headache. Researchers discovered that the intense, throbbing pain of a migraine is caused, in part, by the dilation, the widening, of blood vessels in the brain. If ergotamine could constrict blood vessels, could it counteract this painful dilation? The answer was yes. An injection of ergotamine, or a tablet taken at the first sign of an attack, could constrict the swollen blood vessels and provide profound relief to migraine sufferers. The holy fire, when tamed and targeted, could be used to quench a different kind of fire in the head. This is a recurring theme in the history of medicine. Many of our most powerful drugs are derived from nature's deadliest poisons. The heart medication digoxin comes from the toxic foxglove plant. The muscle relaxants used in surgery are derived from curare. The poison used on the tips of Amazonian hunting darts, the ergot fungus, the medieval monster, was now being domesticated. its demonic power harnessed for human good. But the scientists at Sandoz were not satisfied. They knew about the other alkaloids, the ones that acted on the brain. They began a systematic program of research, led by a brilliant chemist named Arthur Stoll and his younger colleague, Albert Hofmann. They started taking the core structure of the ergot alkaloids and tweaking it, modifying it, adding a bit here, removing a bit there, creating hundreds of slightly different synthetic variations, hoping to find one with useful therapeutic properties but fewer dangerous side effects. It was painstaking work. For each new compound, they had to test its effects. Was it a better biosuccumtic? Did it affect the heart, the lungs, the brain? Much of this work led to dead ends. But occasionally, they would find something interesting. One compound, for example, proved to be a powerful respiratory and circulatory stimulant. It was developed into a drug to help resuscitate patients from anesthesia or drug overdoses. Herein lies a subtle but important historical debate. Was this taming of ergot a purely benevolent scientific enterprise? Some historians and critics argue that it was also part of a larger trend of pharmaceutical companies taking traditional or folk knowledge like the midwife's use of ergot, isolating the active ingredient, patenting it, and then selling it back to the public, often severing the connection to its natural origins. It's a complex ethical question. Where does the line between innovative science and bioprospecting lie? For you, this is all a world away from the simple terror of the fungus. You, who suffered so terribly from the wild, uncontrolled power of these molecules, are now watching as men in white lab coats carefully measure them, modify them, and package them into pills and ampoules. The very essence of your suffering has been bottled and sold as a cure. The poison that made your limbs rot off is now on the shelf at the apothecary, a trusted ally of the modern physician. The irony is staggering. The fungus is still with us, but now it wears a disguise. It has been tamed, trained, and put to work in the very hospitals that were first created to fight it. The ancient enemy has become an indispensable, if still dangerous, friend. The systematic exploration of the ergot alkaloids at the Sandoz laboratory in Basel, Switzerland, continued for years. It was a process of methodical, often tedious, chemical modification and testing, but in the middle of this sober, scientific work, a door was about to be flung open into a realm of perception that would make the medieval visions of demons and shadow beasts seem quaint, and it would happen entirely by accident. Your journey through time now brings you to a specific, fateful date, November 16th, Yojo Senba. You are an invisible observer in the meticulously clean and orderly laboratory of Dr. Albert Hofmann. He is working on a series of compounds derived from lysergic acid, a core chemical component of the ergot alkaloids. He is hoping to find a new circulatory and respiratory stimulant. On this day, he synthesizes the 25th substance in this particular series. Its official name is lysergic acid dialhamate. In his lab notes, it is simply designated LSD-25. He runs the standard tests on laboratory animals. The compound shows some effect on the uterus and causes a degree of restlessness in the animals, but it's nothing remarkable. Certainly not the powerful stimulant he was hoping for. It doesn't seem medically interesting. Disappointed, Hoffman shows the compound. He writes it off as a failure. The file is closed. 5 years pass. The world is engulfed in the flames of the Second World War. But in the neutral city of Basel, scientific research continues. On April 16, Yaojiu Susan, a Friday afternoon, Hoffman is working in his lab. He later wrote that a peculiar presentiment lead him to synthesize a batch of LSD-25. He felt that the original tests might have missed something. As he is working on the final stages of the purification, he begins to feel strange. He feels dizzy, restless. He goes home to lie down. As he closes his eyes, he is swept away. I sank into a not unpleasant intoxicated-like condition. He would later write in his famous memo, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense, kaleidoscopic play of colors. He suspects he must have been accidentally exposed to a trace amount of the chemical, perhaps by absorbing it through his fingertips. He is a chemist. He knows the power of the substances he works with, but the intensity of this effect, from what must have been an infinitesimal dose, is unlike anything he has ever encountered. The ergot alkaloids were known to be potent, but this was on another level entirely. He becomes a man possessed by scientific curiosity. He must know for sure. He decides to conduct an experiment upon himself. 3 days later, on April 19th, Sun, at 4:20 p.m., he prepares a solution of LSD-25. Based on his knowledge of other ergot alkaloids, he decides to start with what he believes is an extremely small threshold dose, 250 micrograms, 1/4 of a milligram, a nearly invisible speck of matter. He swallows the solution for about 40 minutes. Nothing happens. And then, the world begins to dissolve. His notes from the experiment start with dizziness, feeling of anxiety, visual distortions, symptoms of paralysis, desire to laugh. The effects soon become so overwhelming that he can no longer write. He asks his lab assistant to escort him home, and because of wartime restrictions on motor vehicles, they have to travel by bicycle. This journey, which would become legendary in the annals of psychedelic history, is now known as Bicycle Day. For Albert Hofmann, it was not a joyous ride. It was a terrifying descent into a maelstrom of altered perception. The familiar road home warped and dribbled like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. The buildings seemed to undulate and breathe. Colors became intensely vivid, almost explosive. He felt as if he were not moving at all, as if he were wrapped, pedaling furiously on a stationary bicycle while the world outside spun around him. He arrived home in a state of panic, convinced he was losing his mind or dying. His neighbor appeared to him as a malevolent, insidious witch with a colored mask. The furniture in his own home seemed to be alive, threatening him. This was the dark side of the experience, the bad triple perfect, modern echo of the convulsive ergotism victim's demonic hallucinations. The chemical that could produce ecstatic visions of kaleidoscopic color could also produce the absolute certainty that you were in the presence of pure evil. The academic debate around this discovery is less about the science and more about its cultural impact. Did Hofmann unleash a tool for spiritual enlightenment and psychological healing, or did he open a Pandora's box of recreational drug use and social upheaval? The answer, of course, is that he did both. The discovery of LSD's properties had a profound and undeniable impact on psychiatry, neuroscience, and the counterculture of the 1960s. As the terror of his experience subsided, Hofmann was left with a sense of wonder. He had accidentally stumbled upon the most powerful psychoactive substance known to man, and it had been lurking, hidden in plain sight, inside the chemical heart of the medieval monster, the fungus that had caused Street Antony's fire. The poison that burned the limbs also contained a key that could unlock the doors of perception. The story of ergot had taken its most bizarre and unexpected turn yet. The discovery of LSD might feel like the final, explosive chapter in the story of ergot, a leap from the muddy fields of the Dark Ages to the psychedelic frontiers of the 20th century. It's easy to assume that the original disease, Street Antony's fire, was vanquished along the way, relegated to the dusty pages of history books, a medieval bogeyman made obsolete by modern science. But the truth is more complicated. The monster was tamed, but it was never entirely killed. Your journey, which has leapt through centuries, now slows down, moving through the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st. You see a world transformed. Agriculture is now an industrial enterprise. Towering grain elevators have replaced village storehouses. Powerful machines plant, harvest, and thresh the grain. Chemists in white coats test samples for contaminants. Surely, in this world of scientific precision, there is no place for a medieval fungus. For the most part, that is true. In the developed world, ergotism has become vanishingly rare, but it has not disappeared. It lurks at the margins, in places where the modern agricultural safety net has holes, or where unusual circumstances conspire to bring the ancient poison back to the table. You find yourself in 1951, in the small, quiet town of Pont-Saint-Esprit in southern France. It is a hot, humid summer. On August 16th, the town's inhabitants begin to fall ill. It starts with stomach pains, nausea, and insomnia. Then, the full spectrum of horror, which you know so well, is unleashed. People are gripped by terrifying hallucinations. They see flames, smokes, and monstrous creatures. One man, a local laborer, screams that his body is on fire and that his head is turned to lead, and he throws himself from a second-story window. Another tries to drown himself, screaming that his belly is being eaten by snakes. 7 people die. Dozens are institutionalized with severe mental disorders. The official explanation at the time was that the flour from the local bakery had been contaminated with mercury, but many townspeople, and an increasing number of independent researchers, believed the true culprit was ergot. The symptoms were a textbook case of convulsive ergotism. A local miller had reportedly used a cheaper, lower-quality grain due to the difficult harvest conditions that year. The case became a modern medical mystery. A full-blown medieval plague erupting in a post-war European town. The debate about the Pont-Saint-Esprit outbreak continues to this day, making it one of the most famous and contentious modern cases of suspected ergotism. Some historians and journalists have even floated a more conspiratorial theory, that the townspeople were not poisoned by fungus, but were instead unwittingly part of a secret mind control experiment, possibly involving the CIA and the application of aerosolized LSD. While this theory is considered highly unlikely by mainstream historians, it shows how the strange, dramatic symptoms of ergotism can still, even in a scientific age, spawn theories of malice and intrigue. The story doesn't end in France. You see smaller outbreaks, tragic footnotes in medical journals. In Ethiopia in 1978, a famine forces people to consume wild oats contaminated with a related species of ergot fungus. Dozens develop gangrene in their feet and legs. In India in 1975, a similar outbreak occurs from contaminated pearl millet. And it's not just in the developing world. Even in North America, ergot remains a constant concern for veterinarians. Livestock, particularly cattle, are highly susceptible. If they graze on pasture grasses or are fed grain contaminated with ergot, they can suffer from a modern version of street anthrax fire. They develop lameness. Their hooves and tails can turn black and fall off, and they can suffer from convulsions. It is a constant battle for farmers and ranchers, a reminder that the fungus is always there, waiting for an opportunity. You see that the monster has not been slain. It has been managed. It is kept at bay by a series of modern agricultural practices that you, in your time, could never have imagined. But these systems are not foolproof. A breakdown in the supply chain, a moment of economic desperation, a particularly bad weather year, or simple human error can allow the ancient enemy to slip through the cracks. The disease that once brought empires to their knees is now a rare, exotic diagnosis. When a case does appear, it is often a puzzle for doctors, who may never have seen it before. It is a ghost from another era, a medical spectre that serves as a humbling reminder. It reminds us that our complex, technological food system is a shield, but it is not impenetrable. The old horrors, the ancient plagues tied to the soil and the seasons, are not truly gone. They are merely sleeping. You have seen the disease, the cure, the fungus, the molecule, and its strange modern echoes. Now, for the final piece of the puzzle, you must return to the very beginning, to the field. You stand once more in the damp, grey air, the phantom weight of a sickle in your hand, looking out over a sea of drooping rye. The purple-black horns of the ergot are still there, scattered amongst the healthy grain. You know the terror they contain. But now, with the knowledge of centuries at your disposal, you see not just a curse, but a biological problem. And a biological problem can have a biological solution. The ultimate defeat of street. Anthony's fire as a widespread epidemic did not come from a miracle drug or a high-tech invention. It came from a series of simple, mundane, and profoundly effective changes in the way you farm. It came from agricultural science. The first and most important step is simply cleaning the seed. Imagine, before you plant your next crop, you take the seed grain you save from the harvest and you pass it through a sieve. The long, dark ergot sclerotia are mostly larger and lighter than the healthy rye kernels. A simple screening process can remove a significant portion of them. Then, a more ingenious method was developed: flotation. You take your sack of seed grain and you pour it into a large tub of salt water. The healthy, dense rye kernels sink to the bottom, but the ergot sclerotia, which are less dense, float to the top. You can skim them off with a net, like scum from a pond. You are left with a clean, purified seed stalk. By simply giving your seed grain a bath, you have broken the cycle of infection before it even begins. You are no longer reseeding your fields with the cursed soil Brother Michael spoke of. This practice of seed cleaning, while sounding simple, is a subject of some historical debate regarding when it became widespread and truly understood as a preventative measure. While rudimentary sifting has existed for millennia, the specific, targeted removal of ergot based on a scientific understanding of its life cycle is a relatively modern development, becoming standard practice only in the 18th and 19th centuries. The second major change is in the field itself. You look across the landscape and see not just endless fields of rye, but a patchwork of different crops. This is crop rotation. For centuries, you and your ancestors planted the same crop in the same field, year after year. This allowed the ergot sclerotia to build up in the soil, ensuring a fresh source of infection for every new season. But now, you learn to break the cycle. After you harvest your rye, you plow the field deeply, burying any fallen sclerotia far below the surface, too deep for them to sprout. The following year, you don't plant rye. You plant an unsusceptible crop, like turnips or clover. The buried ergot spores might germinate, but they find no host to infect. Their life cycle is broken. They die off. After a year or two of this, the soil is significantly cleaner, and it is safe to plant rye again. And third, there is the simple act of mowing the verges. You look at the wild grasses growing along the edges of your fields and fences. Tillisness work revealed that Cl. avispes purpurea can infect not just rye, but a whole family of wild grasses that often grow as weeds around cultivated fields. These wild grasses act as a reservoir for the fungus, a safe haven from which it can launch its spores to attack your precious crops. By simply keeping the edges of your fields mown and tidy before the grasses can flower, you eliminate this reservoir, creating a biological buffer zone around your harvest. None of these techniques are glamorous. They don't involve prayers or potions or complex chemistry. They are just good farming. They represent the victory of patient observation and practical knowledge over an ancient foe. The final triumph over street. Anthony's fire was achieved not by doctors, but by farmers. Of course, the transition to these methods was slow and uneven. It took generations for this new agricultural knowledge to disseminate from scientific journals and agricultural societies down to the level of the individual, subsistence farmer. For a long time, poverty and tradition were powerful barriers to change. But as these practices gradually became the norm, the great epidemics of ergotism faded away. The fire, which had raged for 1,000 years, was slowly, quietly, and methodically starved of its fuel. You stand in this imaginary, improved field. The rye grows tall and clean. The harvest is healthy. You grind the grain, and the flour is a uniform, wholesome gray. The bread you bake has no strange taste, no hidden poison. It is, finally, just bread. It is the staff of life, and for the first time in a millennium, It is nothing more. And so, you find yourself at the end of this long, strange journey. You have traveled from a muddy field in the Dark Ages to a sterile Swiss laboratory. You have felt the phantom fire in your own limbs and peered through the microscope that revealed your tormentor. You have seen faith, terror, science, and serendipity all swirled together in the story of a single, humble fungus. You stand now, in your mind, in a quiet, modern library. The air smells of old paper and dust motes dance in the sunbeams slanting through the high windows. On the shelves around you are the chronicles of monks, the notebooks of physicians, the faces of botanists, the lab reports of chemists. It is all here, the entire story, pieced together from 1,000 different sources over 1,000 years. What you hold in your hands is a simple loaf of rye bread, bought from a modern bakery. It is dark, dense, and fragrant with the earthy, sour smell you once knew so well. But it is a smell stripped of all its menace. You can slice it, eat it, and share it without a flicker of fear. The monster has been so thoroughly vanquished from the food supply that it has become a folk tale, a historical curiosity. You reflect on how this tiny fungus, this little purple spur, was not just a footnote in history. It was a powerful, active force. It shaped the very fabric of life for centuries. It fueled religious fervor, sending desperate pilgrims on agonizing journeys and leading to the creation of one of the first specialized hospital networks in Europe, the Antonine Order. It directed the course of justice, or injustice. The terrifying, chemically induced visions it created were put into the existing molds of witchcraft and demonic possession, providing what seemed like concrete, physical evidence in countless trials. The line between a victim of poisoning and a perpetrator of dark magic was dangerously, fatally thin, and historians will forever debate the exact role it played in episodes like the Salem witch trials, a ghostly chemical fingerprint at the scene of a historical crime. It helped to drive the progress of science. The sheer horror and mystery of the disease compelled people like Dr. Thuil Lear to look beyond superstition and apply the principles of rational observation, making a crucial leap in the understanding of foodborne illness. It pushed botanists like Thuil to unravel the complex life cycles of fungi, and it forced chemists to develop the techniques to isolate and identify the alkaloids that were its secret weapons. And in a final, bizarre twist, it changed our very culture. From the depths of its molecular heart, it gave up the key to LSD, a substance that would profoundly influence art, music, psychology, and social norms in the 20th century. A direct, unbroken chemical line can be drawn from the convulsive madness of a medieval peasant to the psychedelic explorations of the 1960s. The story of Street Antony's Fire is a powerful, humbling lesson in the intricacies of things. It shows how the weather in the sky can affect a fungus in the soil, which creates a molecule in the grain, which can alter the chemistry of a brain, which in turn can shape the course of a society as faith, laws, and science. It is a reminder that for most of human history, our lives were profoundly, intimately, and dangerously tied to the earth and its hidden, microscopic dramas. You look down at the loaf of rye bread in your hands. It is no longer just food. It is a symbol. It is a testament to the suffering of millions whose names are lost to time. And it is a monument to the patient, collective human effort of observation, reason, and care that finally, after a millennium of terror, drew the poison from the bread and allowed us to eat in peace. The fire has been put out. And now as our story draws to its quiet conclusion, you can feel the narrative begin to dissolve, much like the sharp edges of the day have already softened and blurred. The journey is over and you can allow the weight of it, the weight of history, to simply drift away like dust motes settling in the moonlight. There is nothing left to analyze, nothing to remember. All that remains is the gentle echo of a tale told, a soft hum in the background of your own deepening rest. Imagine that library, the one we were just in, but now it is nighttime. The sunbeams are gone, replaced by the soft, silver light of the moon coming through the high windows. The books are all asleep on their shelves, their stories held in quiet repose. And you are there not as a student but as a welcome guest in a place of profound and peaceful silence. You can find a comfortable chair, one that seems to have been waiting just for you. And as you settle into it, you can feel a deep and pleasant stillness spreading through you, a stillness that belongs to this quiet, sleeping library of time. The air is cool and calm, and with every gentle breath you take, you sink a little deeper into the comfort of this place, this moment. The final word has been whispered. If your mind is still gently stirring, you're welcome to drift into another of my stories. If not, I wish you a deep and peaceful slumber. Good night.